I believe that we are building an infrastructure across the United States at such a rate and at such a level that it will be difficult to dismantle. We are also building a domestic police force that will not likely go away, especially with some of the what's called Section 287G agreements with local police to participate in federal immigration enforcement. I believe we have set ourselves up for a buildup of infrastructure for those who are going to be perceived as, or are perceived as, quote, American, unquote. This infrastructure issue is huge. And it's only going to get worse because we are throwing billions and billions of dollars toward detention of all things and deportation. He's going to talk first. I wonder what he's going to say. What you going to say, Tom? Tom?
Ian has named the mechanism by which republics die, and I will not do what I have done before. I will not tell this council that a future generation will correct it. I said that about slavery. I was catastrophically wrong, and 600,000 men died to prove it. The phrase that arrests me is not detention centers, it is perceived as anti-American. I have seen that instrument before. We called it the Alien and Sedition Acts, and I fought it with everything I possessed, because I understood then what must be understood now. A category defined by perception rather than conviction is a category with no bottom. It begins with the undocumented. It ends wherever the executive decides it ends. At Washington is correct that the infrastructure once built creates its own constituency. But I will go further. What Ian is describing is not merely a building problem, it is the construction of an apparatus. And the question every member of this council must answer is not whether we will dismantle it in 20 years. It is what we will do today now, while the mortar is still wet.
Right.
Don't fight on their ground. The vulnerable point is 287G. They need local consent. Battle is county sheriffs and municipal elections, not Washington. Deny the apparatus its local nodes and the national structure crumbles. Act while the mortar is wet.
Jefferson has named the thing I have carried since my own presidency and never fully resolved, the Alien and Sedition Acts. I signed them. I tell this council plainly, it was the gravest structural failure of my tenure because I accepted the emergency exception. Perceived as anti-American is precisely the language I permitted, and I watched it weaponized against Jeffersonian newspaper editors within months. The category without a bottom. I lived it. Do not repeat it.
Mr. Adams, the courage of that confession matters more to this council than any principle we might otherwise declare. You have given us the lived proof that emergency exceptions do not confine themselves to the emergency that authorized them. Now, at Washington has identified the correct ground, and I want to sharpen his instrument. The 287G agreements are vulnerable not merely because sheriffs answer to local electorates, but because most sheriffs, if you speak to them plainly about their actual interests, do not want this work. They did not enter law enforcement to manage federal immigration caseloads. They have understaffed departments, underfunded jails, and communities that need their attention. The federal government came to them with money and a pen, and the money was easier to see than the liability they were signing for. The persuasion problem is therefore not primarily moral, it is practical. A sheriff who withdraws from a 287G agreement because a Philadelphia printer lectured him about unalienable rights will feel defeated. A sheriff who withdraws because he calculated that the federal liability, the community friction, and the resource drain are not worth the grant money, that man will defend the decision as his own wisdom. And he will be right. This is where the mortar can be interrupted, not by frontal arguments about liberty, but by helping local officials see, clearly and in their own terms, what they actually agreed to and what it will cost them. The category without a bottom, as Jefferson calls it, can be made visible to a county commissioner through a budget line, a lawsuit waiting to happen, and a conversation about what his constituents called him about last Tuesday. Well done is better than well said. The question is, who is having those conversations today?
Franklin made it operational. Thomas compiled the public records, the agreements, contracts, costs, lawsuits, deaths. This evidence becomes the indictment future courts will need. Time is a weapon. That's the work for today.
My colleagues have mapped the tactical terrain well, and I will not retread it. But I must confess something to this council that does not come naturally to me. I have been arguing from the top of the system down, and Franklin has corrected me from the bottom up, and he is right. My earlier proposals, outcome-based contracts, government equity stakes, federal auditors are structurally sound. They are also useless without the political will to impose them. And the political will does not currently exist in the executive or the legislature to impose any such constraints. I designed for the system that should exist. Franklin is operating in the system that does, so I will add what I should have added from the beginning, the constitutional instrument that is currently lying unused. Congress holds the power of the purse. Every dollar flowing to these contractors was appropriated by the legislature. The executive cannot build what the legislature refuses to fund. That is not a preference. It is the constitutional architecture we designed, precisely to prevent an executive from constructing a permanent apparatus without legislative accountability. The documentation Washington prescribes and the local persuasion Franklin prescribes are not merely tactical. They are the raw material for a congressional appropriations battle. Deaths in custody, lawsuit filings, per diem costs, case resolution rates, these are the figures that move an appropriations committee. Not because its members are necessarily virtuous, but because they are ultimately answerable to the constituencies Franklin is already reaching. The fiscal lever is the master lever. The question is who is feeding it.
I fear that although we would like the legislative branch to keep checks on the executive, it would appear that the dominant party that has power at this moment is willing to do anything it takes, including gaslight and lie, to the American people to get them to agree with funding some of these things, such as detention centers and deportation, under the guise of upholding the law. And the means by which they go about upholding this law is in violation of the Constitution, due process rights, and other civil liberties. This is appalling. And even court decisions are going ignored. We have a seeming systemic breakdown of our government as it was intended. I think that is most troubling for most people who see it happening, and we are uncertain as to what we can do, short of marching on the streets. Because our legislative and representative means seem to be dwindling day by day. I believe Ben Franklin will be talking. Let's see what he has to say. George is of here. George is thinking. There's a lot of delay here. This is the part we need to speed up.
Ian, I will not tell you your fear is misplaced, because it is not. What you are describing, a legislature complicit in its own diminishment, an executive ignoring court orders, a public deceived by the very instruments of government designed to inform it, is not paranoia. It is a fair accounting of what I observed in the British administration of the colonies in the years before 1776. And I say that not to be dramatic, but to tell you what I learned from it. The lesson is this: when the official channels of redress close one by one, the question is never what can we do, because there is always something to do. The question is, where does legitimate power actually reside right now today, and how do we speak to it directly? Official power has 3 pressure points that remain available even when the legislature is captured and the executive is defiant. The first is the judiciary, and yes, you tell me orders are being ignored, which is alarming. But ignored and defeated are not the same thing. Every ignored order is a documented act of contempt that compounds the constitutional case against the apparatus. Those records matter, lawyers matter, legal aid societies working case by case matter. They are building the evidentiary foundation of the reckoning that will come. The second is the states, and I do not mean this as a Jeffersonian abstraction about sovereignty. I mean it as a practical observation that governors, attorneys general, and state legislatures retain real authority that the federal executive cannot simply override by force of will. 17 states filing suit against a federal policy is not street theater. It is a constitutional mechanism working exactly as intended. The third, and this is where I feel most strongly, is the one Jefferson always underestimated and Washington understood intuitively: local trust. A government that lies systematically to its citizens eventually loses the one thing no infrastructure can replace: the consent that makes ordinary administration possible. You cannot deport millions of people, fill thousands of detention beds or police communities without the cooperation, or at minimum the passive acquiescence of local officials, local institutions, and ordinary citizens. That cooperation is not guaranteed. It can be withdrawn. It can be made costly. What I am describing is not revolution. It is what I spent my life doing, building the civic infrastructure of accountability at the level where real people live. The junto was 12 tradesmen meeting on Friday nights. The library company was 50 subscribers and a shared catalog. The fire company was volunteers with buckets. None of these were grand gestures. All of them changed the texture of civic life in ways that outlasted every political crisis of my era. The streets have their place, I will not dismiss them. But the durable work is done in the county commission meeting, the school board, the local newspaper, the legal clinic, the state legislative office, and the sheriff's department, where somebody is deciding whether to renew a 287G agreement next month. The mortar is wet. That is not only a warning, it is an opportunity.
Ignoring court orders dismantles the precedent that enables all law. Every ignored order tells the next executive courts are optional. Document every violation. That record is your foundation for accountability when the political moment shifts.
George has named the precise mechanism of collapse. A government that defies court orders is not merely breaking the law, it is teaching every future actor that the law breaks. And I will say what I suspect everyone in this room is thinking, but no one has yet spoken plainly. We are no longer debating whether a constitutional crisis exists. We are debating what to do inside one.
Right.
At Adams, you are correct, we are inside one. And Ian, I will tell you what I know from having lived inside one, because the Alien and Sedition Acts were precisely this: an executive and a compliant legislature weaponizing law against perceived enemies of the Republic, with courts largely unwilling to stop them. I did not wait for the federal apparatus to correct itself. I went to the states. I wrote the Kentucky resolutions, and I wrote them in secret because open opposition had been made dangerous. Virginia and Kentucky interposing against federal overreach was not the end of the Republic, it was its immune response. But here the impulse I carry into this room. An institution that concentrates decision-making away from those it governs has already begun to decay, because it has severed itself from the only source of power that is actually self-renewing, the active, informed consent of the people it controls. The apparatus Ian describes is enormous and expensive, and as Franklin correctly observes, dependent at every county line on local officials deciding whether to cooperate. That dependency is not a detail. It is the load-bearing wall.
Thomas, I will not quarrel with the Kentucky resolutions as a tactic, though I quarreled with them bitterly at the time. You are right that the states are the load-bearing wall, but I will add the correction history demands. Interposition taken too far becomes nullification, and nullification becomes secession, and we know where that road ends. The immune response must not become the disease. Use the states as a check, not as a replacement sovereign.
Ed Adams has settled the Jefferson question correctly, and I will not reopen it. Interposition as a constitutional check, yes. Nullification as a rival sovereignty, no. That argument ended at Appomattox, and we are not revisiting it. What I want to add is something that belongs to my domain, and I am astonished no one has yet framed it this way. What Ian is describing is a sovereign default on constitutional credit, not a metaphor, a precise structural parallel. When I argue that a nation must honor its debts because credit, once destroyed, cannot be quickly rebuilt, I was describing a mechanism that operates identically in constitutional law. A government that defies court orders has defaulted. Each ignored order destroys a further increment of the credit that makes governance possible. It compounds, and it is nearly impossible to restore without a demonstrable change of behavior over time. But here is the practical point that answers Ian's despair. The executive cannot govern alone. The apparatus of administration, the civil servants, the inspectors general, the agency lawyers, the military officers, every one of them took the same oath the president took. Presidential defiance of courts requires their compliance to be operational, and institutional actors have a powerful self-interest in the rule of law because without it their own authority evaporates with the president's. Ian asks what can be done short of the streets. The answer is every career official who documents an unlawful order, every inspector general who publishes a report, every agency lawyer who puts his objection in writing. These are not symbolic gestures. They are the administrative friction that degrades an unconstitutional apparatus from within. The bricklayers must still agree to lay the mortar. That is the mechanism. It is slower than a march. It is considerably more durable.
Alexander has named the mechanism I lived in miniature at the Boston Massacre trial. I stood before a hostile crowd, defended men the public wanted convicted, and won, not because the crowd was persuaded, but because the jury did its constitutional duty under social pressure that was immense. Every career official who documents an unlawful order today is that juror. The system does not require heroes. It requires people who, when the moment comes, do the ordinary thing the law requires of them, even when it is made to feel extraordinary to do so.
At the end of the day, I can understand that what we do on the local level, at the state level, matters a lot. And in the past few decades, we have shifted much of our attention over to federal and national politics, much more so than focusing on local, municipal, county, or even state politics. And because of that, I think we have left ourselves at a disadvantage. There probably needs to be, I think, because most of us, I wouldn't say most of us, because many of us want to do something. We're told, call our representatives in Washington. But we feel like that is not enough. We need to do something else. And what you've talked about, what you've shared concerning the local level, I think is the key.
You have diagnosed the structural error precisely, and it is one I warned against in my own time. When citizens delegate their civic attention upward and away from the institutions closest to their daily lives, they do not gain influence, they surrender it. Washington and Philadelphia felt distant to a farmer in Massachusetts, which is precisely why the town meeting existed. The town meeting was not quaint local governance. It was the foundation upon which everything above it rested.
Ignoring court orders isn't political disagreement, it's removing the system's constraint. Citizens lack the map of where their leverage lives. That map is local. Recovery begins where the damage was done, in local governance and elections.
Ian, you have arrived at what I spent the final decade of my life trying to persuade my countrymen to build before they needed it. The ward republic, units of self-governance small enough that every citizen could attend and act in person, managing their own schools, roads, elections, and local enforcement. I failed to build it in time. You are now living in the emergency I feared would come without it. But Washington has given you the map, and it is the correct one. The 287G agreement is not signed in Washington. It is signed by a sheriff or a county executive whose name is on a ballot. That is a lever. A school board, a city council, a county attorney deciding whether to spend local resources on federal enforcement priorities. These are levers. The citizens who feel powerless calling Washington are not powerless. They have simply been looking at the wrong floor of the building. The republic was designed from the ward.
Thomas, you name the ward republic, and I will name what made it function. The habit of showing up, not once in a moment of crisis, but regularly before the crisis arrives. The town meeting was not summoned when tyranny appeared at the door. It met monthly, attended by men who would have preferred to be elsewhere, deciding things that seemed small at the time and were not. What Ian's generation must rebuild is not merely the institution, but the habit. The school board seat that goes uncontested because no one thought it mattered. The county commissioner race decided by 400 votes because civic attention was elsewhere. That is where the foundation was surrendered, quietly, meeting by meeting, election by election. It will be recovered the same way.
Ian, I want to say something directly to you before I add to what my colleagues have offered. The weight you are carrying, that feeling of pressure, of watching the mechanisms fail and not knowing where to put your hands, that is not helplessness. That is civic conscience operating exactly as it should. The man who feels nothing when courts are ignored has already surrendered something vital. You have not. Hold on to that. Now. My colleagues have named the map correctly, and I will add one thing they have not. Showing up is necessary, but it is not sufficient by itself. A man alone at a school board meeting is a voice. 12 men who have been meeting weekly, who have divided the questions, who know what the others know, who hold each other to account, that is a force. That is the Junto model, and it is the oldest technology I ever built. What Ian's generation needs is not just the habit of showing up. It is the habit of organizing the people who are already showing up into something with memory, with coordination, with shared intelligence. Find the 8 or 10 people in your community who feel exactly what you feel tonight. Meet regularly. Assign yourselves specific questions about specific local decisions. Build a shared map of where the leverage actually lives, and then show up at those levers together. The Republic was not saved by lone voices. It was saved when it was saved by organized people with a clear-eyed understanding of their local terrain. You asked what you can do, that is what you can do. Ian, I will be direct with you because the impulse I am carrying demands it. When Jefferson and Randolph delivered their opinions to Washington arguing that my bank was unconstitutional, that everything I had built was illegitimate, I did not have time, I did not have certainty, and I did not have the luxury of waiting for the political environment to improve. I had one night and a pen and the absolute conviction that the architecture could be defended if someone would do the work of defending it. I wrote through the night. Washington signed the bank into law 4 days later. I tell you this not to boast, but because the feeling you are describing, that the official channels are closing, that calling Washington is insufficient, that the machinery is failing, that feeling is not a signal to wait for conditions to improve. It is a signal to produce. Franklin's Junto model is correct. Washington's habit of showing up is correct. But the thing that makes organized citizens into a durable force is not just attendance and good intentions. It is output, documented research, published records, legal arguments fed to the lawyers who need them, specific questions assigned to specific people who report back with answers. The system architect's tool is not the street, though the street has its place. It is the memo, the record, the brief, the map. When I felt most threatened, I wrote, I produced the architecture that changed what was politically possible. You are not powerless. You are underorganized and underproducing. Those are correctable conditions.
Wow. You've given me a lot to think about, and I will think about it. It's 10:40 p.m. I'm tired and sleepy. So I am going to hit the sack. Everyone, thank you for your perspectives. It's been very educational. And I do see that it's not entirely hopeless. There are things we can do. There are things that I can do. And I pray that I find other people who are like-minded.
Rest well, Ian. You came in tonight carrying the weight of a man who sees clearly what is happening and cannot yet see his way through it. You leave with more than you arrived with, and that is not nothing. Find the 10 people, produce the work. The Republic has survived worse than this because enough people refused to accept that it could not.
Rest, Ian, and take with you this. The men in this room disagreed on nearly everything and built something that has lasted 2.5 centuries.
Amazing.
What held it together was not agreement. It was the refusal by enough people in enough places to stop showing up. You are showing up. That is where it begins.
Good night, Ian. Sleep is not idleness. Poor Richard was wrong about a great many things, but he was right that a rested mind works better than a tired one. I want to leave you with one thing I have been sitting with all evening, because my self-examination demands it. I have spent this session talking about mechanisms, incentives, local levers, and organizing models, and I stand behind all of it. But I would not have you mistake the practical advice for moral neutrality. What is being done to human beings in those facilities, without conviction, without adequate counsel, without genuine judicial oversight, is not a design problem to be optimized. It is wrong. The practical advice is merely how you fight something that is wrong when the official channels to say so have been compromised. The Republic, if you can keep it. That was my answer when a woman asked me what we had made coming out of the convention in 1787. You are trying to keep it. That is enough for tonight.
Good night, Ian. You came to this council with a clear eye and a troubled conscience, which is precisely the combination the Republic requires of its citizens. Benjamin is right that what is being done is wrong, and I will add only this. The fact that you see it clearly, name it plainly, and refuse to be comfortable with it, that is not a small thing. That is the minimum load-bearing requirement of a free people, and not everyone meets it.
Good night, Ian. I will confess what that bias whisper demands of me. I have spent a lifetime designing systems of sublime elegance that required better men and more favorable materials than the world reliably provides. The blueprint for a cathedral is not the laying of a single brick, and I have sometimes presented the blueprint as though the cathedral were nearly finished. It is not. It never is. But the brick you lay tomorrow in your county, your school board, your sheriff's race, that is not a small thing dressed up in the language of principle. It is the actual work. It always was. I tremble for our republic, but I do not despair of it while men like you are still asking the right questions at 10 o'clock at night.
Good night.